In January of 1973, Tex Ritter actually visited Thomas Hart Benton along with a couple of other representatives and actually proposed it. And over whiskey, as you'll see it from the article upstairs, the panel copy upstairs, they agreed to do a mural. And so that was kind of the start of it.
Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. That's better. Good afternoon. My name's Seth Feman. I serve as Executive Director and CEO at the Frist Art Museum just up the hill from here. Before we go any further, I'll invite you to go up the hill later today or tomorrow to see some additional Thomas Hart Benton works that are on view in a current exhibition that we have. If you're here today and you've got a ticket stub with you, or if you mention that you were here today, either today or tomorrow, we'll let you in for free at the museum. So make a trip up there and enjoy it. It's my privilege to welcome you all to the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. It is fun to be at a partner museum of ours and to spend some time with all of you. Thank you for taking time out of your afternoon to spend with us and participate in what is going to be an exciting conversation about the sources of country music. We have been backstage talking, and it sort of felt like we could just keep talking forever about this incredible work of art, and I'm glad to bring you all into the fold of that conversation in just a few minutes. So, with that, welcome, and I'll invite the panelists to start making their way out here. I can hear them. They're coming. That's right. So I haven't introduced you all, so now you have to sit there and be embarrassed while I read these great bios. We have a really incredible group of people here with us today. I'll start with Henry Adams, who's seated in the middle. Henry is a graduate of Harvard College and received his MA and PhD from Yale, where he received the Francis Blanchard Prize for the best doctoral dissertation in art history. In 1985, he won the Arthur Kingsley Porter Prize of the College Art Association, the first time this had been awarded to an Americanist or a museum curator. As museum curator and Americus, we like to think that we can follow in those footsteps. In 1989, when he was a curator at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, William Jewell College awarded him its Distinguished Service Medal for his services to Kansas City and the Midwest. In 2001, when he was a curator at the Cleveland Museum of Art, he received the Northern Ohio Live Visual Arts Award for the Best Art Exhibition of the Year in Northern Ohio. In April 2010, The Beauty of Damage, a Tom Ball Telos public production film that he initiated and scripted with Tom Ball, won the Kodak Best Ohio Short Film at the 34th Cleveland International Film Festival. In June 2010, he received the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Cleveland Arts Prize. On September 26, 2015, he received the Art Admiration Award from Art Neo in Cleveland and was honored with an exhibition of work by artists he had championed and a publication of excerpts from his writing on them. In spring 2017, he received the Baker Nord Award for the Humanities, bestowed on the most outstanding scholar in the humanities at Case Western Reserve University, and today he's here with all of us. Thank you for being here. Katelyn D. Crawford, Kate, lives and works in Birmingham, Alabama, where she is the William Carey Halsey Curator of American Art at the Birmingham Museum of Art. Her work foregrounds diverse, expansive histories of American art, as well as local and regional experiences. At the BMA, Crawford manages all aspects of the care and presentation of the museum's American art collection. Among her exhibitions are the forthcoming Hayward Obrey Structural Integrity, 2024 it will be open, and Magic City Realism, Richard Coe's Birmingham. During her 7 years in Birmingham, she has extensively grown the permanent collection of American art. Prior to BMA, she curated at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, Missouri. She's a native of Des Moines, Iowa, and she earned her PhD from the University of Virginia and her BA from Columbia University. Okay, thank you for being here. Last but not least, closest to me is Elek Horvath, the Associate Director of Collection Access. In this role, he oversees a team that is responsible for the administration and management of artifacts moving to and from the museum, artifacts processing and data management, internal and external communications and logistics with respect to artifacts and exhibits, collection inventory and environmental monitoring, and control of archive and exhibition spaces. It is a lot to take care of. He joined the museum in 2000 to work on the Journal of Country Music. He co-authored the book Hat Show Print, The History of a Great American Poster Shop, published in 2001. In 2003, he became Special Projects Production Coordinator and helped license music used in the Grammy-winning CMF Records compilation Night Train to Nashville, Music City, Rhythm, and Blues. In 2004, he was appointed Collections Registrar, a position he held into 2019 when he was appointed Senior Registrar. He is curator of the museum's recently opened exhibit, An American Masterwork, Thomas Hart Benton's Sources of Country Music at 50. He holds a bachelor's degree in English from the University of Maryland, and before that he served in the United States Marine Corps. Elek, thank you for being here. So when I was asked to come today and moderate this conversation, I was really excited because we have this arrangement of experts with a variety of perspectives. Although they all have a rich interest in Thomas Hart Benton and his history, they all have different disciplinary backgrounds, different kinds of training, and that gives them really unique perspectives on the subject matter at hand. I was especially interested in this because I'm a returning Nashvilleian. I was born and raised here. I was born just a couple years after the mural was complete, and I remember going to the old Country Music Hall of Fame building, and we'll see some pictures of it later, where it used to be installed. And I remember a very bizarre experience when encountering this mural when it was still new, in that, to me, and granted I was really young, it looked really old. It looked like it was an old thing, and yet not either, and it's confusing. It looked old because of the subject matter. It was meant to be historical material, and it looked old because I knew that the style that it was in had a kind of historical trend to it, and it looked a little bit old because it was effectively an old barn building that had been designed into the museum. And yet it also had this city around it, which was a very new city. The city was kind of bubbling up in every which way and seemed to be pushing in a new direction. And then the image itself had this kind of dynamic appeal to it. It's a very rich image that seems to really move when you're looking at it. So once it seemed old and dynamic, there seemed to be this contradiction, and there seemed to be all of these stories hovering around it. And then, being a little kid, I went on my day and never thought about it again until more recently when I got back to Nashville. It seemed like no better occasion than to spend some time thinking about these diverse possible meanings. And I think when we were backstage, Elek said, the work is a story-generating machine. And my hope is that we can spend some time exploring that today. So with that, I will take my seat and we'll begin. And I think the first thing that we'll do actually is move to, I think we have a video to introduce the work that we'll see.
I started out with the original drawing in pen and ink, plus the drawings which I've made from real life, and combining these, something slightly different comes out. I then make a clay model representing the whole picture. The clay model simulates the three-dimensionality of life. That is, it's no more just an imaginary thing, but it's real there in this clay. I don't think that it would be possible unless I made the study in clay to project the figures three-dimensionally in the way in which I do. But as long as I have projected them three-dimensionally in the clay model, the next step is simply to get the same effect on a flat surface that I got in the model itself. question of how do you think up a mural has often been asked me. Well, I don't start thinking about it till I've got a patron who wants a mural. In the case of this particular mural, Tex Ritter, who was a famous singer and connected with the Nashville Foundation, came to me and said they were thinking about a mural for their new building. Well, just talking together, we decided that we would not make a painting of contemporary music, but of the sources of country music, show its origins in the actual folk singing. Now that's the way the mural started, a conversation between a patron who wanted a mural and me, who wanted to do the mural, but we had to agree on some kind of subject matter before we could even start talking. And then the thing should be, and in my case always is, left up to me to determine its form, how to do it, and how I'm going to do it.
I sort of don't know what to do after seeing that. That's really amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I think for many of us, that might be the first time that we've seen and heard Benton talk about this mural itself. And maybe that would be a good place to start. Elek, you've done a lot of the research on the current exhibition and on the object itself, and I wonder if you can just take us back to the beginning and illuminate some of what Benton was talking about here with the origin of the mural itself.
Sure, it's a fascinating tale, and I'll come at it from a different angle. In February of 1973, there's an article in the National Observer, which is a weekly Washington magazine, and talking about Benton's yet another Benton last mural. And the first last mural referred to in the article was actually Benton's mural. It's at the Truman Library and Museum in 1961. And at that time, he said, "That's it. It's the last mural I'm doing." And it seemed to be the case because within 5 years, he'd had a stroke and a bad heart attack. So it would seem to have been the end. But no, actually, 10 years later, he picked up the commission for the Joplin City Hall mural. And this is what they're referring to in the article being it's yet another last mural. But in fact, the irony is that the article, which was written in February of 1973, occurred a month after Benton had accepted another commission, his last mural for us, because in January of 1973, Tex Ritter actually visited Thomas Hart Benton along with a couple of other representatives and actually proposed it. And over whiskey, as you'll see it from the article upstairs, the panel copy upstairs, they agreed to do a mural. And so that was kind of the start of it. And from that point, it all initially started, another irony, with Joe Allison, who was a Capitol Records executive, a record producer, and an art collector and artist himself. And he had the idea, after seeing that first last mural, it's at the Truman Library, and thought it was a great idea. So he took it to his friend, Tex Ritter, as I mentioned, who both of them were on the Country Music Hall of Fame board, and they both had done foundational work for both the Country Music Association as well as the Country Music Hall of Fame. And they took it to the board, and that's what got the whole ball rolling there. So that was agreed to, and they agreed. Then they had to approach financing, and here's where the Tennessee Arts Commission came in, and the National Endowment for the Arts. And so the National Endowment for the Arts actually had a grant set aside for the $20,000 grant to create this mural, and it took a little while to get that going. It was initially meant to be forwarded in May of 1973, but in fact that fell through to the board, and so they basically waited until September. And at that time, they forgot to tell Benton that this was still an ongoing process. So he kind of began to wash his hands of the entire thing. So they had to reconnect with Thomas Hart Benton were still interested, and we'd still like to go with this. And one thing led to another, and things began to really roll in the end of that year. The actual formal agreement occurred later in the following year, in 1974. But it was a series of steps and fortuitous gatherings, and Norman Worrell was the director of the Tennessee Arts Commission at the time. He was with Tex Ritter at his visit, and he helped pretty much shepherd this entire process, because there's a lot of moving parts when you're trying to seek government funding and financing and so on. So it was quite the adventure, but they accomplished it, and he got underway fully and spent all of 1974 working on the mural, and the rest is history.
Yeah, we in a little bit later, we will look at the process of developing the mural itself in quite a bit more detail, but I'm curious to know more about why Benton was chosen, and I know that one of those reasons was because of his deep knowledge and experience in music. And maybe Henry, you could talk a little bit about that. And we've got several images related to that in our stream here.
Well, of course, Benton was probably the principal figure in the regionalist movement of the 1930s, which was very much associated with the Midwest, and was really the first time that the South and the Midwest had been put at the forefront of American art. But he also, Benton himself is interesting in terms of his interest in music. He basically, he became interested in playing the harmonica actually quite late in life, when he was in his 40s. And while he was on his sketching trips around the United States, he would collect country music tunes. He even invented a new form of musical notation for the harmonica, which is still used by music publishers, which basically, rather than reading notes on a staff, it tells you which hole to blow through and whether to blow in and out. And it's a much easier way of learning to play music. Benton, and this is a side of his career which I think still needs more research and investigation, but I think he played quite an important role in introducing, as it were, the urban intelligentsia to American folk music, and making it acceptable as something to take seriously. And Pete Seeger, for example, was first introduced to folk music, first heard the song John Henry when Thomas Hart Benton gave a performance on his harmonica at the opening of his America Today mural in 1930. So in many ways, he was a natural choice, and a great many of Benton's paintings portray music or are related to country music songs. One of his most famous paintings is The Jealous Lover of Lone Green Valley, which is a popular song. Yeah, and Benton, as you just saw, he did a record for Decca. This is The Jealous Lover of Lone Green Valley, which mixes together a Tennessee fiddler with, it's actually Jackson Pollock who's playing the harmonica down on the left-hand side. Many fascinating aspects of Thomas Hart Benton, but
am I right
he was the first and only teacher of Jackson Pollock, and they had a lifelong relationship.
And didn't they perform together in the 30s? Didn't they have a hillbilly band?
Well, he had a hillbilly band, yeah. Jackson Pollock, I think, never really learned to play the harmonica, but he had other students who did. Jackson Pollock never got further than putting some tissue paper over a comb and humming, but.
And Benton's family was also musical.
Well, actually, both of Thomas Hart Benton's sons became musicians. His son T.P. played the flute, and Jesse Benton was a wonderful folk musician. Benton used to go to the to Martha's Vineyard every summer, and Jesse and Carly Simon were the two great rivals on Martha's Vineyard as singers. And this is a wonderful painting that Benton gave his daughter a painting every year as a present, and most of them have some kind of still life arrangement that's the same number of years as her age at the time. So, there'll be 6 seashells or 7 roses or whatever, but this is a painting he did for her 16th birthday.
I wonder, Kate, maybe you could talk a little bit about how music appears in some of these images. If we could go back 1 or 2 to the
I think
the Ballad
going back
of the Jealous Lover. I think that's a really great one to look at and to understand. Not only is he interested in music, but he's interested in depicting how music might feel or might look. Do you mind elaborating on that?
Yeah, I think this is a perfect painting to start talking about, to talk about that. And it's great that we've already talked about Jessie Benton a little bit, because she said you could see and feel music in her father's art. And I think even without understanding all of the sort of technical compositional devices that are happening in this painting, I at least get a sense of that. It's the way that he's undulating form within this continuously across the entire composition. There is something really rhythmic about the way that he constructs composition, and that's coming from his musical interests that are very clearly depicted here. The Ballad of the Jealous Lover of Lone Green Valley really is an Ozark folk song, and Benton is from the Ozarks. I mean, he's really trying to preserve a kind of musical heritage in this painting, tell a story about American music that he's scared is being lost, and he's invested in really representing a climactic moment in that song as this woman is stabbed by her fiance, kind of a violent painting, stabbed by her fiance because he suspects infidelity. That's not in fact there. But I'm, in this painting in particular, just dazzled by this sort of abstract swirl that connects the group of musicians in the foreground of the painting to the climax of the song that Benton is depicting. And it really reminds me in so many ways of the synchromist work that Benton is doing in Paris with Morgan Russell and Stanton McDonald Wright in the 19-teens. Synchromism is essentially an American art movement that is established in Europe by those individuals I mentioned, those artists I mentioned, that's really looking at color to create abstract form, and thinking about color almost as you would notes as part of a musical composition, thinking about the way that music and form, to simplify it, are related. And Benton paints in this really abstract way early in his career, even though he absolutely disavows modernism. He says, I'm not a modernist. He completely is. I mean, that's a beautiful abstract passage in this painting. And it's really the thing that ties together these two groups that are giving you this narrative of the song and his experience with music in this composition. This is also a really early musical work, 1934. Henry mentioned Benton picks up music later in his life, in his 40s, about 1931. And so, he's really quite fully realized in his interest in this subject as it comes to pass. Here's another very direct rendition of a folk song, Coming Round the Mountain. And you sort of have every element. This is even earlier, 1931, so really right as he starts playing the harmonica very seriously. And you have every element of this folk song in this composition. You only have 5 white horses as opposed to 6 that she is driving, but down to the rooster that becomes the chicken and dumplings at the end of Coming Round the Mountain, which you have in the lower right corner of the composition. You really have every aspect of the folk song depicted here, every climax within that.
And was this pretty common that he was making, I don't want to call them illustrations because it sounds reductive, but where he is illuminating a kind of historical song, where he's kind of capturing or creating image based on and titling it after songs?
Yeah, he's doing it continuously across his career.
Sure.
This is his earliest lithograph, I believe, engaged in that practice, and this is right as he becomes more seriously engaged with this history of music, as he starts playing the harmonica more seriously. But from this point, from 1931, really continuously until he, dies in front of the sources of country music, he's making these paintings that are directly engaged with songs, as well as paintings that are more broadly engaged with music, like the portrait we saw of Jesse Benton.
I'm jumping ahead in topics that I'm sure that we'll get to and pick up again later, but I'm curious, you've mentioned his kind of rejection of European modernism and even American modernism, and yet how much he is still quite clearly a modernist in what he's making. I wonder how he was received by, I've known about his rejection of kind of the New York art scene. I wonder how others were looking at images like this, or even the portrait of Jesse, or the others that we've seen, which have these hometown Ozark-based stories, and yet are clearly, unquestionably employing the visual vocabulary of the avant-garde at that moment. So were there other artists? I mean, even you mentioned Jackson Pollock, his protege, and their ongoing friendship. Was there a tension there as well, or was it a sort of acceptance of what Thomas Hart Benton was doing?
Both would be my guess.
I think Benton's career is interesting. In the 1930s, basically the big breakthrough was when Henry Luce, for Christmas Eve in 1934, wanted to do the first color story for Time magazine. And he came up with the idea of featuring the regionalist group of American artists, which was basically Thomas Hart Benton, Grant Wood, John Stewart Curry, a few others. And that basically catapulted Benton to a level of popular fame probably never before achieved by an American artist. He was the first artist featured on the cover of Time magazine, and suddenly he was at the same level of fame as major political figures, movie stars, financiers. This was something new in American culture. On the other hand, this became just the point where he basically became very controversial among modernist artists, often of the so-called political left. And I think that's a combination of the very fractious political world of the 1930s, and then Benton himself was, of course, not exactly tactful on all occasions. So that Benton is a curious...
That was a very tactful way to say that he's not very tactful.
Yeah. He was someone who shot from the hip, which was also characteristic of his daughter Jessie, I might say. That seems to be a family characteristic.
And his father and his great-great-uncle.
Yeah, I might say that Thomas Hart Benton was named for his great-uncle, Thomas Hart Benton, who was the first senator from west of the Mississippi. But Senator Thomas Hart Benton killed a few people in duels, and also once had a brawl with Andrew Jackson in which he lodged through a few bullets in Andrew Jackson that were there for the rest of his life. So, he came from a sort
colorful
of...
people.
Yeah. People who weren't afraid to fight for things. And his father was a U.S. congressman who was very associated with William Jennings Bryan and the populist movement.
How did Benton respond to that fame that sort of appeared fairly early in his career and put him in a unique position? I mean, it's really, in some ways, the first time that an American artist is being made into a kind of rock star in more contemporary terms. How did he feel about that? Do we have a sense?
Well, I might say it's a very fascinating family story, because basically his father Benton decided quite early that he wanted to be an artist, and his father was quite vigorously opposed to that. He wanted his son to be a lawyer or a politician, which were the only suitable things for a member of the Benton family. So that Yeah, it was very difficult for Ben to become an artist, and then an interesting turning point in his career is his father was dying of throat cancer back in Missouri, and Benton had not seen his father for something like 10 years, went back, sat by his deathbed, and then after his father's death is the point where he starts making travels around the United States and goes from being a modernist to a painter of the American scene.
As I recall from the story, too, he was sitting by his father's deathbed, listening to all his old cronies come by and tell him and remind him about how it used to be on the hustings and just bring it all home. And he really got a strong sense of the stories that were told and all the country folk and so on. He began to think about the place he'd come from and all these types and characters and people that made up his childhood and his life and his future in art, too.
Yeah, and I might say also, in some ways, the great role model for what Benton did as a painter is Mark Twain. And Benton wrote about the fact that even in his years in Paris, where he was studying modernist painting, he would still reread Huckleberry Finn every year, and that was his connection. And I think in many ways, many of the qualities of Mark Twain's work, the sense of exaggeration, the sense of humor, the interest in different characters and regions, is something you see in Benton's work as well.
And it's interesting to me how you have that interest in Mark Twain across his life, the death of his father in 1924, everything coalesces, I think, in a way for Benton. And he really is, by the time that Time magazine article comes out, I don't think he loves all of the aftermath and the fighting that ends up happening, sort of not only interpersonally, but also in the press. There is a lot of condemnation of what he's doing and what regionalism is and this movement that he's now been thrust to the forefront of. But I do think he loves being a celebrity. And he's, he was a part of the movie industry prior to that. And I think to your question, Seth, he loves that attention and he wants to be known for this work. He's a larger than life character, and it's a character I think in many ways he's playing, and he struggles to take off when he's not in public. But he is this persona that Henry was alluding to earlier that's full of bombast and larger than life, and I think he loves the attention.
Yeah, to a certain extent he became that character.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we'll get into this a little bit more as we go, but we were talking about the comparisons between kind of music stardom and music writing and art stardom and art production. And maybe that's actually a good segue to talk a little bit more deeply about Sources itself. Elek has prepared this extraordinary exhibition upstairs that if you haven't been to yet, I really encourage you to spend some time. It is rare in art museums to get to spend a lot of time with preparatory drawings and to understand the process of making step by step by step. Oftentimes, an artwork seems like it has been, delivered from the artist's brain fully formed. And when you get the opportunity to understand how revision processes work, how choices get made, and how collaborative that is, you learn quite a bit. So, Elek, I wonder if you could spend a little time and take us through some of the sketches, some of the discoveries that you made, and others. Please weigh in as you see things there that you notice as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think Henry was telling me it's pretty uncommon to have a collection like this with Benton, because so many of the things, there's just no room to keep all the preparatory works for all these murals. This is a relatively small mural, a 6x10 mural, and many of his murals, most of his murals are larger and occasionally just huge, much, much larger. And you can imagine all the work that went into that. He couldn't keep that around the house or store it, so it went away. So here we have a nicely rounded collection of 52 pieces. And
let me just say how rare that is. Those of us who have worked predominantly in art museums, oftentimes all you get when you acquire a work of art is the thing. You don't have the opportunity, and sometimes just because of the division of what institutions are, there's not an archive to care for those other kinds of materials. So the Country Music Hall of Fame Museum is a very special design in order to be able to accommodate all kinds of materials and really preserve those. So please.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the first sketch you see before you. And I really love this sketch because this is the kernel of the mural that never changes for all the rest of the processes you go through. You have roughly sketched, you can see dancers on the right, and then the the more rough sketches on the left, rougherly, that's a good word, it's fiddlers to the left, and then the church on the hill. And as we move forward, we'll see that again and again. They never go away. They move around. And what is going on here is that for him, the movement of the dancers is the movement of music, and that is the actual expression and the feeling. And he thinks that the dancers capture that best. And later on, as he begins to develop it, there is a dialogue with the Country Music Hall of Fame about, well, do dancers really need to be in the center of the mural? And he would say, yes, because that's kind of the heartbeat. That is the life. That is the movement, and everything works around that. And you'll see as you develop these other sketches here how that is playing out. Here's, again, as I mentioned, here are the dancers. First of all, these are two compositional sketches that he created, that he submitted to the board for review and approval. The first one on the left, it's his first shot at it, and it's dramatically different in some ways than the one on the right. And there's a lot going on here, but the first sketch you saw, the compositional sketch, the dancers are still there. The fiddlers are off to the left, and the church is still on the hill. As is the case on the one on the right, that still doesn't change, but a lot obviously does change. And the first thing you'll notice is that suddenly the cowboy, who's been quietly riding on the hill with cattle, is now front and center to the right, and the largest figure in the painting, in the sketch. This is because Tex Ritter, who had helped develop this entire idea, had sold the commissioning idea to Benton, died. And so this, in the middle of the process here, and I think it was January of 1974, I think it was. I might have the date wrong. But they wanted to honor Tex Ritter, so they brought him up here not to create an exact likeness of him, but to create an impression of him playing a cowboy. If you don't know who Tex Ritter is, which I probably should have said up front, Tex was quite an amazing character. He's in the Country Music Hall of Fame, but he started out nearly going to law school before detouring to Broadway. And then in Broadway, detouring to Green Grow the Lilacs, where he was actually a cowboy figure in that, before he became a broadcaster for the first cowboy Western broadcast out of New York City, before detouring to Los Angeles and Hollywood, and that entire scene, creating more than 70 films, before as well simultaneously developing a musical career along the way. And getting an Academy.
Didn't he run for office as well? Wasn't he a politician at one point?
I don't know. Roy Acuff did, but I don't know. I wouldn't put it past him because he tried pretty much everything else he could get his hands on. So Tex was beloved, and as I said, he was a foundational member for this institution as well as the Country Music Association. Everything Tex did, he went all in, and he was usually the first one there. So that's to give you a sense. And he was beloved. He was if you see a picture of him, which we have somewhere in here. He's a big, warm, and of course you may know his son is John Ritter for the Three's Company and other fabulous, and remember, here he is. And so you get a sense that here's a man larger than life, completely comfortable with his own skin, and quite beloved. Anyway, back to the actual pieces themselves, there's in addition to the cowboy moving, it's something less noticed is that the banjo player who's been on is an African-American banjo player, and he has now moved further back to the rear there. But he's not losing, I think, any sense of dimension or importance. It's just a different perspective, and we can go into that in more detail later. But more importantly, you'll notice there's kind of a back framing wall across the first sketch which disappears, and the entire sketch suddenly opens up in space and dimension. And in the new figure, nothing is on the same plane, vertically or horizontally or into depth. And there are suddenly organic forms that have swept across the front, and he's beginning to project form and create a deeper thing, in a sense, anticipating his next step into creating a clay maquette. The figures are smaller, they're more spaced, they're given chances, and here, in fact, is the clay maquette. You may remember from what we just heard from the video we watched that this was special for him. For him, to repeat him, if I may, the clay model, it's represented the three-dimensionality of life. It's no longer an imaginary thing. It's real in this clay, to paraphrase him. And here's where he began to shape all this out to develop his color schemes. You'll see the bright reds and so on. It's very impressionistic. It's leaning into space there. There's the train and bits and pieces. All these pieces have shape and form. And in order to create his next step, as he mentions as well on the painting, he paints directly, more or less the same size, a fully finished color oil work, as well as a black and white work. Why the two works? The one on the left will be the underpainting that he will paint on the mural surface, and then he'll paint the color on top of that, which actually was a fairly developed technique at the time, creates extra dimensionality, more tonality, and it just creates more dimension depth to the painting. And so these are the two side-by-side pieces, and you get a sense of, if nothing else, the liveliness and the action of the works. So, and again, we can get into more detail. There are a lot of it's elements going on here. There's a lot of it's art influences going on here, impressionism and all over this, as is something Renaissance art. I should mention with the clay model, he got that idea not from Impressionists, but from a Tintoretto, who was a Renaissance painter from Venice, who was his nickname was Il Furioso, so which might have appealed to Benton in his own right. And if you ever see, just to detour for a second, a Tintoretto Last Supper, it looks like an absolute food fight. There are bodies all over the place. They look like they have been, they're blotto around the good Lord, who is calm in the center, but everyone else, it looks a little out of form. So it was a lively model to start from, and I believe all his subsequent models were based upon that. They were full of life.
I love hearing about this. If we could go back a couple of slides to the image of the two drawings where you can see the changes, I'd like to dwell there for a minute because of something in the video that we heard. I was so glad to hear, encouraged, heartened to hear Benton acknowledge that the real thing that you need to create a mural is people to commission it. That they don't exist if you don't have somebody who is supporting it and getting involved in helping you realize it. And I wonder, as he went through these drawings, and maybe you could focus on these or others could notice things that change, I wonder how much of this was his own decision, how much of this was his patrons requesting changes or suggesting ideas. You mentioned a little bit about Ritter, but I wonder if there's other elements that you can see developing here that are part of the commissioning and development process.
Surprisingly, no. Benton really insisted on having, yes. Benton insisted on having control of the form. And while he welcomed input initially via correspondence with the Country Music Hall of Fame board, in fact, he offered, Benton's way of doing it was to offer suggestions about, well, I think it should be this, this, and this. The choral group, the dancers, the fiddlers, and basically he went ahead and painted his suggestions in a sense. But he did get input on the train. Bill Denny from the Country Music Hall of Fame board said there should be a train, and Benton actually kicked himself for saying, "Oh, I should have thought of that," because he loved trains, and it's the first time one of the very earliest pieces in Henry's book is a childhood sketch of a train, a very good likeness, I would note, as well. And his entire life, all of his murals, trains appear. Not merely trains, they always have a full smokestack going. I think he loved the entire drama of the train, the billowing smoke and all the entire attitudes of train, to the extent that when it actually wound up in his drawing, in his final piece, at his funeral, his lawyer and friend Lyman Field said he thought that the train actually represented Thomas Hart Benton. Whether or not it's true, I like it to be true, because here in the mural is this train barreling right through the middle of the thing, and probably the loudest thing musically or audio in the entire train is that train. So I tend to think it's a good thing.
I'd love to hear other perspectives on the train, because to me it seems like such a dramatic change in the drawings that the train appears, and it seems, as you've described it, everyone thought it was an obvious thing to have there, and they sort of like, duh, why didn't we include this from the beginning? but why? What is so obvious about a train?
Well, I might say that in the background, what you're seeing is the two routes by which country music traveled, and one was up the Mississippi and Missouri River, and the other was along the railroad. And interestingly, the first major country musician was Jimmy Rogers, who had worked as a railroad brakeman, and basically his genre of music was the railroad song, but that's one of the early genres of country music.
And to be clear, of course, this train is not that train, but this is actually Casey Jones's 382. There's a famous ballad about Casey Jones's crash and whatnot, and that was incorporated here. This is not literally that train, but one very much like it. It's I think it's it's a 632, I think it was, or something like that. But it's a very similar train, and it's just kind of amusing side note. Probably the tiniest figure in the entire mural is, in fact, the conductor. Casey Jones, presumably, just barely visible there in the window. So,
I might say that the first million-selling country music hit was "The Wreck of the Old 97" by Vernon Dalhart, and that exactly corresponds with when Benton started to turn to American subject matter and also to represent musical themes and railroad trains in his paintings.
Okay, do you have thoughts on the train?
Of course, he makes a painting of the wreck of the old 97 as well. And so this really is a theme that persists across his body of work. The train is interesting to me too, because I think in the video upstairs in the gallery, Elek, Benton really talks about the importance of the train in the evolution of country music, and that it's not sort of a point of origin for country music, but it's really a point of transition. And a lot of these train songs were some of the first recorded songs that are associated with the genre. And so, I think too, in that same video, Benton talks about how these are really his sources of country music. He's not going to do any research. He already knows what he needs to know to paint this painting at the end of his life.
I didn't need to do any research. I knew that stuff.
I knew that stuff, right? And he's been studying music at this point since really before the early 30s, but at least since the early 30s. And I think this, again, is really part of this being an incredibly personal project for Benton as well. It's kind of an icon of Benton himself, as Elek said, and it's a theme across his body of work that's picked up again, and also his understanding of the genre he's painting, or of the sources he's painting.
Yeah, I'm so fascinated by when I was doing my introductory remarks, I was talking about, for me, the kind of tensions that I perceive in this work. To me, a train always symbolizes this kind of rush of energy, and the way it's depicted, as you described, it's sort of barreling through this scene. It feels like progress, momentum, moving forward. But depicted in the 1970s, a steam engine is a thing of the ancient past at that point. I'm thinking of, I'm a photo historian, and Winston Link did all of these photographs of the steam engines being replaced by the electric, but by the 1970s, that was all gone too. We were moving in different ways by freight mostly. So it seems an unusual element to get such prestige. And while I recognize fully that there are these musical references that he's drawing on, and there's some potentially personal representation, which I love hearing that, there is this kind of tension of, well, is this moving us forward? Is this really hearkening to the past? Henry, I really like your recognition of these sources and pathways, these geographic pathways of how this musical form is being shared. I wondered a little bit about how Benton himself felt about that. His interest in music wasn't expressly country music. He seemed really interested in folk music per se as his own musical training. And I wondered, when he began working on this project, was there effectively a country music learning curve for him, or did he feel like folk was the source of country music? How did that work out? And there's a couple images of him doing some drawings here of specific sitters, and that might help illustrate some answers.
Well, and can I go back to the train for a second,
Yes,
Seth? Kind of
sure.
riffing off of what you said. Benton's trains are often pretty violent, actually. They're sort of going too fast. They're about to go off the tracks. He paints a lot of train wrecks, you know? And would be a strange place for that to be happening too, although this train is certainly going full blast. And I think earlier in his career when he's painting trains, it's, some art historians have really read those trains as a metaphor for questioning what is understood as progress in the United States. Is this good? Is it going too fast? What is being displaced by this? And Benton, as a regionalist, is somebody who's interested in the history of, America and American culture, isn't quite sure whether that, full-barreled progress, that full-barreled forward motion is good or not. And so there is a tension here, or an oddness in him including this in the 70s, and whether it has that same resonance or something different, or whether in some ways too, Benton is just reappropriating key themes from throughout his career in this mural, is something I've wondered too. We can move forward with the folk music.
Yeah, let's pull up those images of him doing the sketches from life, because I think that might illuminate some of this as well. There we go. So who is this, and what's happening here?
Yeah, this is Benton. Actually, despite his somewhat questionable health here, nevertheless took the field to the Ozarks to start sketching a variety of people for the mural. And in this particular instance, he ran into Raymond Buffett. And he wasn't able to do this kind of thing for long, but for a period of time, he got a variety of really excellent sketches. And so here he is actually sketching Raymond Buffett, and that is the sketch as seen it. And of course, it looks like very much the face that wound up on the fiddler's body, reemphasizing again, that's not necessarily Raymond's body. Basically, the bodies effectively were just designed to capture the form and the shape of the fiddler, but very exactly, of course. But the heads often came in either exactly or shaped or modified to create an archetypal. Benton had, I think, and Henry can talk to this more.
Well, to me, there's a mythic quality to Benton, and this is an episode of that sort, because Benton's last sketching trip out to sketch Raymond Buffett and some other musicians was Branson, Missouri, which at that point was absolutely nowhere. And it seems to me sort of prophetic that later became, of course, a great center of country music.
He was there first.
And it seems that, I probably shouldn't mention that in Nashville.
It's okay.
But
we know they exist.
But I think Benton, and this is one of the qualities of his work of the 1930s, but he had a sort of instinct for the things that other people were overlooking that were going to become important. And I might say that at the time Benton did this mural, country music had become, a national art form, but the country music business was nothing compared to what it is today. And probably many of you know, but popular music is now America's largest economic export. It's our largest single national product. And that's a whole development that would have been inconceivable at that time.
I find the piece before us, Chick Austin here, interesting too. First of all, he's an interesting character. He's playing a jawbone, which is not a typical instrument there, but I believe that parts of his face were incorporated into the fiddler on the right. Because the fiddler on the right, I have several sketches upstairs where you can see the progression of a face towards the ending, but the deep lines and whatnot, I think came from Chick Austin, because there's a very distinctive look on that fiddler, which I see only in this sketch.
I'm struck by this, again, there's this tension between something that is honoring the sources, but also on some level mourning their disappearance, their history.
Mourning or honoring them?
Both. And so honoring, absolutely. I mean, he's making a mural about them. So there's no other honor, no greater honor than I think a mural. But there is something about this sorrow that pervades some of the imagery, and Benton would reflect on it himself. He had a couple of passages referring more to folk music, I would say, but he said something like, "I'm glad to have heard the sad twang of mountain music before it died." That there's this sense that something is being lost. He rails on the canned music of the contemporary scene. He seems to be kind of opposed to it, but it's hard to tell how much of that is that kind of bullish persona that he has adopted, that kind of contrarian position, and how much of it is a true sense that these things are really gone, or that he's really hostile towards the new forms. And I wonder if you have a sense of that from knowing him as someone who's worked so much on his biography. Do you get a sense of
well,
kind of where
I think
where
like
he sits
a lot
in
of
this?
older people, you get towards the end of your life and you look back with nostalgia to all the things that have completely vanished, that aren't there anymore. And I do think that there's a nostalgic quality to this mural of looking back to a kind of country music that didn't exist anymore, but on the other hand, seeing that as the foundation for an art form that grew out of that. There's a sort of bittersweet quality to that.
It is a truly bittersweet. I mean, it is such a beautiful image, and yet there is this, especially I think often about the way that the musicians framing out the dulcimer and the guitar, the way they're turning backwards.
It's something we haven't said directly, but Benton was not young when he did this mural. He was 84 years old, and it's kind of amazing for someone at that age to be taking on a project like this.
I would also note that, to your point, I believe they're playing by moonlight. And that, I think, captures an entire sense of the nostalgic kind of, there's a certain, or twilight even, but there's definitely a sense of something passing in the lighting.
Yeah. While we have the full image up, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the figure of the African-American banjo player. You had mentioned before the kind of repositioning, but not diminishing. And I think that there are also, to my eye, there are a group of African Americans sitting just behind him near the water's edge. And I wonder where African American music and musical tradition fits within this history for Benton or for the commissioners, sort of how it's realized in the work. And anyone?
I'll say something quickly, that the positioning from the early sketches, the very first sketch shows kind of an African American figure just carrying he doesn't really have a personality or shape or form yet. And yet I think here he has formed up and is, if you actually see the mural standing, if we can go back to that slide for a second, if you walk up closely, or if you walk into the rotunda above us towards that figure and get closer to it, it'll actually appear to move forward towards you a bit. It has, you'll see that space is cleared out around the figure. He's given room to kind of be his own person, and I find it has kind of a lightness of being. There's actually more dignity and form and shape than this photograph or photo image suggests. That if you walk up more closely, it appears to move towards you and create a presence of its own. This is true of other figures, but I'm particularly struck by that. And Henry and Kate can both talk about this, but if there are what I think are African American figures in the background greeting the arrival of the steamboats. And to my sense of it, that they are part of the story of the songs that arose from the riverboat source music, as it were, greeting. They were roustabouts. The roustabouts and various workers on these steamboats were largely African Americans, so they're meant, I think, to be an extending character of that. They're just, I think it's also pulling the eye, also to technique into the distance to cast the drama of the piece.
I guess I'd just make 2 points about this figure. One is that he's in the background, which in a certain way would be historically true, of the way American country music developed, but also if you look at the way the composition is done, it sort of converges towards that background figure. The other thing, and Benton was smarter than he looks in some way, but the banjo is generally thought to be an African instrument, and Benton was clearly aware of that.
I'm curious about maybe his sort of ongoing interest in class and race. He'd spent so much time being an advocate for those who are dispossessed or under-supported. He had real sympathy for working people and aligned himself in many ways in his work. And that shows up, I think, in his depictions of African Americans throughout his career. I think we've got one other in the slide deck here, where you see during the Depression era, sharecropper plowing out the field, so basically destroying the crops due to federal mandate. Eliminating food at a time when food might have been needed. I don't know. Do you want to reflect on this image? I know you've seen it before.
Yeah, I mean, and also the mural. I think it's an interesting choice for Benton to represent the African American influence on country music as a banjo player in the mid-1970s. In 1973, he talks about how he knows that many of his paintings representing African Americans aren't being shown in American museums anymore because of the way that he's represented those figures, which can be read as dignified, but often can also be read as caricature or almost bordering into stereotype. And there's a tension for me in that figure because I think the banjo Benton is smart and he knows the history, and the banjo does sort of originate in African instruments of a similar type and is brought through Black communities. But I think there are a lot of places he could have gone in this painting to represent an African American presence that wasn't quite so much a Northern perspective on a Southern experience, which is what I think he recreates repeatedly throughout his career. And this figure is both sensitive and the kind of figure that you would be seeing in Northern representations of the Southern experience, painted both by Northerners and Southerners who are showing in the North. And I think this is an interesting tie to the exhibition that's at the Frist right now, Seth in Southern Modern. There are, certainly by the 70s, if we're not, Benton is an early white artist representing Black Americans. There are certainly lots and lots of Black artists representing Black Americans in New York in the 20s. I mean, with the Harlem Renaissance, we have a real flourishing of visual culture around the Black experience. But by the 70s, I mean, there are a wide range of expressions of what it is to be a Black individual in the United States and to be a Black musician. And so for Benton to go back to the banjo player, which is almost sort of treading in some of the visual language of caricature, I think, and stereotype is an interesting choice for me and one I'm not totally sure what to do with.
Yeah, we're talking a little bit about this backstage, and it's such a rich and complex topic because the style that Benton has had through his entire mature career is one of kind of honoring, and yet also there is a, for lack of a better word, a kind of cartoon quality because of the exaggeration of form, the elongation of form. And in certain instances, that can certainly dovetail with certain stereotyping. Other times, it can seem to not. And I too share that sort of question about, it's not so much his intent, but how once that image goes out in the world, how it gets perceived.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say I have an odd footnote to this because Benton's mother was pretty much a prima donna, and he was largely brought up by an African woman, Aunt Mariah Watkins, who was also the local midwife in Neosho, Missouri. And the curious footnote to this is that Aunt Mariah Watkins was also the adopted mother of George Washington Carver, the great Black scientist. And what are the chances that an African American woman in Neosho, Missouri is going to be kind of a major influence on two of the remarkable figures of America in the 20th century? I might say, curiously, George Washington Carver was a pretty good painter. He was
fabulous
not,
painter.
He wasn't as good as Benton, but he was definitely a painter of professional competence.
Yeah.
There's actually, if you ever get to Tuskegee, they have in the museum there, their entire wall of pigments that he's developed from various shades of clay. So it's actually quite an engaging thing. There's also a wonderful photograph of him painting in a studio space surrounded by Victorian women in full dress, and he is just, it looks wholly out of place and wholly at home. It's quite a wonderful picture.
Yeah, I love that point, Elek. As the person representing Alabama, George Washington Carver is a fabulous painter, in addition to a very important scientist. And I think in some ways that I didn't know that bit of Benton's biography, Henry, and it makes the choice even more curious to me in some ways. There's a painting I almost wish was in the Southern Modern exhibition, but is in the Birmingham Museum of Art collection. And please, everyone, visit Birmingham. It's a stupendous museum in a stupendous city by an artist who's working in Birmingham named Arthur Leroy Bairnsfather. And it's a fabulous portrait of George Washington Carver painted in 1934. And he's regal in his lab. And there are these incredibly human, deeply individual, really complex portraits that are telling different stories about Black life in America being painted even by the early 1930s. And I think Benton knows that. I mean, he's a well-traveled, well-read, and very thoughtful person. And certainly by the 70s, post-civil rights movement, having the politics he has, to varying degrees and with varying presentations across his life, I mean, it's just an interesting choice to make to represent the banjo player the way he
And
does.
I think it's actually interesting. There is Time magazine in that original cover story wrote about him having cartoonish ways of describing. And I think there is a tension in Benton's work between cartoonish and real. It's part of his modernist impulse.
Absolutely.
And I'm kind of fascinated how it appears and disappears, or it both sometimes. You wind up with a very realistic but cartoonish stretching character there. So it's, for me, for Benton's work, ever there.
It's a good point, Elek. I wanted to know earlier, we don't just see this in his Black figures. His white figures, too, are almost caricature or stereotype. That elongation that he's pulling from all kinds of different formal sources, some of which you mentioned.
Yes.
I wonder, we and I love sort of trying to pick apart intent and vision and orientation and sort of perspective from the artist, but I am also curious about reception, and I wonder if we could just turn a little attention to what happened when the mural itself was unveiled. I think we've got some images of the original Country Music Hall of Fame building and some images of it installed. And I wonder, Elek, in your research, do you have a sense of kind of what happened when this work went on view? Was it a triumph? Was it well received? Did people line up as you see here, much like they line up today to come in? Did they come to see it?
I don't think it was the same impulse. I think a lot of the initial drive was this crazy idea by it's a couple of guys who are wrapped into the whole museum. The museum was brand new at this point, just like 5 or so years old, and they wanted to have some crown jewel coming in that opened up the possibility of the museum. It's arrived on the popular culture scene. And to a certain extent, claiming its place in the world of fine art too. Mm-hmm. Popular culture had a place there as well. And I imagine, and all I can do is imagine, that the audiences maybe didn't know, and it's probably true here to a certain extent, even to this day, if you're coming in to see country music and instruments and museums and cars and all the manifestations of a popular music form, and then you go and suddenly you walk into a space and here's this great big painting, it takes an adjustment. And if you're not prepared for it, it's kind of what you bring to the painting is what you get out of it to a certain extent. And at that time, of course, they're also trying to celebrate the sources of country music itself, bring people back to what this is about, how this music was formed, celebrating the music. And here, of course, is Texas Widow's Widow, and Frank Jones, an early board member at the opening there. And it was on a wall. It was on a wall coming down from, I think there was Hall of Fame plaques up behind where I would be sitting and so on. But it was kind of a dramatic piece on your way down the stairs and out the door. So now it's different.
Well, it's such an interesting point. I'm really glad that you mentioned kind of the the addition of high art into a country form as something that was a decision that was made, that there is this kind of authorization or merging when you bring in potentially the most famous American painter, certainly at the time, and bring him out of retirement again and commission a major work, not a tiny work, a major work, and put it on view here in Nashville, Tennessee, before Nashville was the Nashville that we know now. It was a real arrival of a whole new form of art to merge with what Country Music Hall of Fame was trying to do.
Truly a giant leap of the imagination. It really, not many museums can think outside of their boxes in some way, I find, no matter what the kind of museum it is. We've all traveled and worked in museums our entire lives, and it's rare that you come across a museum doing something brand spanking new that makes you think totally different thoughts about what it is you're seeing, what you're seeing, and anybody who can do that has done something really wonderful.
Yeah, let's flip to there's one more image of how it's installed now, which is very different than the way that it was originally intended here in all of its glory. And we were debating, I think, quite a bit about what happens to the image in a space like this. I'm curious to hear you all revisit some of those points.
Yeah.
Well, I must say that I think that if Benton is looking down from the sky, he probably feels very pleased with the way this is presented. And I think it's wonderful that you've got this amazing museum here, but then the culmination of the experience is seeing Benton's mural and then these plaques celebrating country music. But it's as though Benton's art is being sanctified in some regard.
I will say, go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say that's very much how it felt to me, that Benton's art was sort of sanctified. And as somebody who spends every day in an art museum that's just chock full of paintings, it was a very jarring presentation choice for me because it is so individuated and alone. And honestly, to me, the space felt very chapel-like, despite the selfies, and authoritative. There were a lot of them as I was looking at it yesterday. But the painting feels very authoritative, which is an interesting choice for a work that is ultimately also so deeply personal. But I know you have a different take in some ways, Elek, that I think is fascinating.
I guess I'd say that I also think that the painting adds something to the whole experience of the museum, because a lot of the museum is about contemporary pop culture, and this is something that makes you think about country music as something that goes deep, deep into America's heritage.
I'd say a couple of things. First of all, there's a great big change from the place it came from to the place it is today. The place it came from, the entire building was kind of, if those of you who may remember, those of you who have never visited when it was there, a great big barn building. It was kind of fascinating. It was country, really country. And so the clash was even stronger in some sense there then. Now you're in a space and in a building that is chock full of symbolism. There is symbolism in the architecture, and certainly this space here is full of it as well. That piece coming in, the shape coming down from the ceiling is the bottom end representatively of the WSM Tower. Will the circle be unbroken? The entire thing is in a circle. You have a waterfall or a diamond stream, as Ed Snodderly's lyric puts it, a source, if you will, pouring down from the side there. If you give it time to give it some shape, and of course we are honoring, and will the circle be unbroken, we are honoring effectively all the people who have contributed in some magnificent form to the development or shape or sustenance of country music, and they are being honored. So there is kind of almost a spiritual element to it. It's almost overly solemn until you get to the mural, and then here's a riot of color and movement and effectively music, and it kind of, I think it's a great jarring contrast. It's authoritative, but it's meant to be authoritative. It's supposed to, if effectively you catch it right, it should be a punch in your aesthetic sense. Ignore this if you will, and that's very Benton-esque, I think.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think? So I'm going to ask two questions in the few minutes that we have left that are things that our historians hate, because I'm asking them to make conjectures, which is really fun. What do you think Benton would think about country music today? Now that if we had 50 more years of music history, and he's thinking about country music and this commission, what do you think his take might be on the music scene that we've got in front of us now?
I'll let you guys take it first.
Well, I can at least make a nod to Beyonce and say, arguably, Beyonce just made an album steeped in musicology,
yes.
So maybe he'd be a fan of that.
Yep.
Dubious, but maybe.
I think he would basically love bluegrass. It's older forms of bluegrass because it would do a lot of the instrumentalist things that he still loves. Also, there's certain trends in country music. It's continuous traditionalist trends as the music expands to different, it invariably tends to circle back in on itself. Rhiannon Giddens and her entire thing of the banjo, I think he would appreciate. That's, to be more precise, she has turned a lesser known but equally valid African American string music. It was a very valid part of early country music. And Rhiannon Giddens has done a lot with her group to celebrate that. And she's also done a tremendous amount of other kinds of things to return to the sources of country music, if you will, and to celebrate it for everyone else and kind of reimagine it to its sources. And I think there is this continual tendency to circle back to the sources. What would he actually think about modern music? It would be alien to him in so many ways.
I might just say, one of Benton's most controversial murals was the one he did for the state of Missouri, which was called A Social History of the State of Missouri. And it opened with a scene of a fur trader selling whiskey to an Indian, and it closed with a picture of Boss Pendergast, the notorious political boss of Kansas City, sitting in a nightclub with two of the trustees of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. Benton, that was very controversial. A bill was instituted in the state legislature to have it whitewashed, which fortunately didn't happen. But Benton at one point was asked whether he loved the state of Missouri, and he said, "I'm interested in it." And I think if Benton came back today and said the country music scene, he'd say, "I'm interested in it." I think it's all the things that he was interested in that are exemplified in the country music scene today.
It's really great. I am minding the clock, and I would love to take, if we've got any questions from the audience, I can kind of see you all, and I will re-ask a question if I see any hands out there. Yes, in the back.
Thank you very much to all of you. This was great. I have a quick question. Did Thomas Hart Benton ever illustrate any children's books that you know of?
So I'll just repeat the question for the prompter. Did Benton ever illustrate any children's books?
I guess it depends how you define children's books, but he illustrated Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain.
Anything like Pecos Bill or like the cowboy theme?
He did an illustrated version of, what's the name of it? You mentioned it with Tex Ritter was in the performance on Broadway. Green Growth the Lilacs,
Yes,
which was the basis for the musical Oklahoma.
Yes.
He did do that. He illustrated The Grapes of Wrath.
I would note on that one, that collection I've seen, there's actually a number of wonderful lithographs for the Grapes of Wrath, all kinds of really, Tom Joad and others, very strong. We haven't had much time to talk about it here, but it's just a small insert. Benton's lithographs as a whole are worthy of taking some time to look up. I think and I'm not an art historian, but I was deeply moved by spending some time with his lithographs. They're strong, powerful, very, I think, tremendous technique, tremendous emotion. I almost like many of his lithographs more than I like his murals because they're so experimental. They're so It's really a remarkable collection. If you have a chance, I would look up his lithographs and learn how a passionate artist having fun looks.
Other questions?
I just wanted to recommend looking up Saturday Night at Tom Benton's, the album he did. It's really excellent, and I listened to it this morning in advance of this discussion. It just set the mood. So it is findable if you're not aware and worth the effort.
So a recommendation to look up and listen to Saturday Night at Tom Benton's.
It's tremendous fun. Thomas Hart Benton just plays away and noodles around and is clearly having a ball. And his son on a classical musical piece is an exuberant flute player and absolutely lights up this thing with just, they clearly loved playing. And that picture that we showed earlier of them playing together in a parlor setting, I think some of it's captured in that album there, and I also recommend it.
I would just say that I also think it's fascinating that Benton didn't pick up the harmonica until he was 40 years old, and became good enough to produce a professional record. And I've talked with professional musicians who've, complimented his technique. He really was gifted, and it's surprising to pick up something like music so late and manage to do something so excellent.
Any final questions? Yes. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Jim Sheridan.
Hi, Elek. I got here a little bit late. I'm not sure if y'all are from the Nelson Atkins or not, but I got two questions. One is the Nelson Atkins the largest facilitator of Benton's work? I grew up in Kansas, and I remember always there was good work there, so that's the first question. And the second one, help me form this. A regionalist isn't exactly, I'm going to ask for a better definition of what a regionalist is, because I think you can be a regionalist and be nationally known, but when I say from Kansas and I've been here in Tennessee, I remember, and you may know of this guy, Burger Sanzane from Lynchburg. We all grew up with Burger Sanzane. But he was a regionalist, so nobody knows about Burger Sanzane, so you qualify that by saying, well, okay, he was a regionalist. So my question, if I can give one out, is you can be nationally known, cover of the magazine, and a regionalist, but could you give me a better definition, someone up there, of what a regionalist is?
Let me try to do both of those as questions here briefly. One is Nelson Atkins. Is it the primary repository of Benton work, which we can answer? And the second is, let's say, what is a regionalist, and can you be a regionalist and nationally recognized or nationally known at the same time?
Yeah, I have quick comments on both those things. The Nelson Atkins Museum probably has the largest collection of paintings by Thomas Hart Benton. But also an extraordinary place to see his work is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has his mural, America Today. And there was a recent piece in the New York Times about 7 things not to miss in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Benton's mural was listed as one of the things, as one of the 7 best things in the museum. I have to say that I do sort of a double take. I did this major Benton Centennial exhibition in 1989. One of the reviews of it, the critic said this was the worst exhibition he had seen in 40 years. John Russell, the art critic for the New York Times, came out to Kansas City when the exhibition was up to look at some Henry Moore sculptures that the museum had just purchased. He was asked if he wanted to see the exhibition, and he said no. So this will give you a sense of how Benton's reputation has changed dramatically in just the last 20 years, and I think is still not fully appreciated, for example, his influence on Jackson Pollock. Trying to remember what the other, regionalist movement. I think the regionalist movement has different dimensions, but when Henry Luce did the story in Time magazine, part of what was fascinating about that story was the notion, how would I say, this was the period where if you were an artist, you had a French beret and you dressed as though you lived in Paris and you painted society ladies.
Which Benton actually did when he first came from Paris.
Right. It did society ladies in satin dresses. And the idea that you could go to the Midwest, which was viewed as or the South, which was viewed as a cultural backwater, and create art out of that was a very startling idea to Americans in that period. And I think that Benton was really quite courageous in the way he cut through the snobbery of his period and the rather artificial distinctions between high and low. And Benton is a little unusual among the so-called regionalists. Basically, Grant Wood painted Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Benton traveled around the United States. So the emphasis is on the South and the West and the Midwest. But Benton, to a greater degree than the other regionalists, was interested in the diversity of American regions and American culture.
And I would do a speed answer to you, Jim, as well, and that is that, not being a historian, but my instinct is the more regional you are, the more, and with talent and with verve and with expression, the more national you will be appeal. Will have appeal.
I mean, I think, again, I'd say go see Southern Modern because there are some really fabulous people who are painting in sort of a regionalist vocabulary, who are very invested in painting a particular place, who didn't become well known at all, that I think are shown in that exhibition. And so it's an interesting counterpoint to this for me in some ways.
Thanks for that plug. I'll take that as an invitation
It's a great show.
to remind everyone and the people who came a few minutes late that today, for the rest of the day, and tomorrow while we're open at the Frist, if you mention that you were here, we'll let you in for free for those 2 days. Come enjoy the exhibition. There are 2 Benton works on view, but don't miss, especially while you're here, seeing the drawing show and spending some time with the mural itself. It is truly remarkable and a wonderful experience. I'd like to wrap up by saying thank you to everyone for taking a chunk of your Saturday and spending it with us for this very rich conversation. Thank you to the speakers who have shared many, many things with me that make me think very differently about Benton, a figure I thought I knew before, but will revisit in a new way. And thank you to the crew here for making this such a wonderful experience and jumping around with the slides as we change the script up left and right. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you all so much for being here with us.
Thank you all.